So this is the beginning of wrapping up the semester, and as we do that, we've looked at these major world religious traditions. I want to bring things back to how do we address certain realities, and one reality is pluralism. Now, before watching this, you should have read one short article by Peter Berger on pluralism and secularism and modernism. And I want to get into what his thesis is about this and what we're dealing with here. But and that's our focus here, is how do we approach religions and religious traditions in a modern context, in the world we live in. If you're a believer, if you're not particularly religious, wherever, some issues to think about. Why did we study this at all? And part of my reasoning, I think I said at the beginning of the semester, was to kind of create an intellectual hospitality, that we strive to listen to other people's views and see what they're saying. Not so we necessarily agree with them, but so that we don't simply kind of create our own false images of what people believe and misunderstand. We can't converse, we can't engage, we can't interact with other cultures if we don't even bother to listen to the way in which they understand themselves. And oftentimes secularism, the modern world, those who are not particularly religious don't really understand religious people. And they don't see the realities in the world around them. So if you haven't read the Berger article, you need to do that before we jump in here. But modernism, I'm using this to kind of encompass the current world. In philosophy, we talk about the modern and we talk about the postmodern. For this discussion, I'm just grouping all of those together because they're really kind of two sides of the same coin. The one grows out of the other very organically, in a sense. They share the same roots. So we're talking about the world we live in philosophically, intellectually, artistically, our modern values and understanding of the world, the way we see things, and how that impacts the way we see traditions and religions. And I also want to look at this idea of pluralism. Some people look at pluralism as a value, like we should be pluralistic, as it's something we ought to do. I'm not going there. I'm not trying to make that argument, and that's not what Peter Berger is talking about in his article. He's a sociologist, and he's looking at a reality, just what is. We live in a cultural context that is a plurality of beliefs. My great-grandmother was born a little over 100 years ago in the small town Lower Alabama, and I knew her. She died when I was a junior in high school, back in like 1990 or 91. She passed away, but I had talked to her, and she told me stories about growing up. And one of the stories that she told me was about the first airship, think like a blimp, the first thing like that flew over her town. And this is in a very an era of prohibition, when drinking is illegal, so it's considered very wrong. Drunkenness is a major ordeal and a major problem. Tobacco is looked down on by people who are more kind of upper class religious. Gambling is it's a very bad thing in the kind of common understanding of morality and what you should do. So it wasn't the day of public lotteries and things like that. So these ideas of smoking, drinking, gambling, these were the bad things you could do, and the people who did those all the time were considered the kind of the good-for-nothings in town, the kind of not devout, not believing, not great people. And when this airship flies over the town, something that these people have never seen, what happens? all these, kind of rogues of towns start throwing away their alcohol, their liquor, their cards, their dice, their tobacco, their cigarettes, their cigars. They start throwing all this stuff away because they think this is Jesus coming back. Now, why do I tell this story? Because it shows something about culture 100 years ago, that even the people that weren't particularly religious had a pretty commonly held view of the world in which God is expressed in Jesus in the Bible, and the thing that you should fear is Judgment Day, which will happen when Jesus returns. If someone was religious, with the few exceptions of maybe here and there you might find a Jewish community, for the most part, if someone was religious, they were a Christian. And the biggest division would have been between Christian and Catholic. So there would be this, some religious division between Christian, meaning Protestant, in the kind of popular term. There were more Protestants than Catholics. So you have this Protestant-Catholic divide, and occasionally some Jews, but really, for the most part, in most of the country, especially in rural areas, you came into contact with people that had the basic same belief system as you. And that's just not the case anymore. With TV, radio, the internet, just kind of mass media, the way things work, we live in a very different world from that. Our world is, for all practical purposes, pluralized. You are more likely than any of your ancestors to live next to have a friend who is a radically different background belief system than you are. And so that creates difficulties for religious people. It creates difficulties for non-religious people. And that's what this Berger article is looking at. So we'll jump into this article. And noting that at the start of the article, Berger talks about this idea that since the Enlightenment, really, and maybe even a little bit before, there's been this idea that the more the world modernizes, the more it becomes, focused on technology, scientific advancement, that the more that happens, that the world will become less religious. And there are ideologists, there are people who kind of grieved over that reality and wrote about it, how sad it was, it's reality. Max Weber is a famous religious scholar who saw that as a loss, but he believed in secularization. And this is the article, this is what Berger was kind of changing his mind on. In the 60s, Peter Berger said, when the world modernizes, when we become more scientifically and technologically advanced, we by nature just become less religious. Berger didn't present that as a good or a bad necessarily. He tried to come at that as a very, I would say, kind of unbiased approach as he could. Max Weber saw it as a loss. He was a religion scholar, earlier religion scholar, who saw it as a loss to society, but he believed that it was secularization, that modernism leads people to be less and less religious. And if you look at philosophy and politics and psychology, right, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, many of these people celebrated this idea, right? We're shedding our past, right? So what was from your questions, if you think about your questions for the Berger reading? Nietzsche had this idea God is dead. Marx was anti-religious. He said religion is the opiate of the masses. Freud talked about, he hated religion. He said it's an illusion. And then these were the types of things that were kind of popular throughout the late 1700s, early 1800s, throughout the early 20th century. There are these movements, and even to today, there are these movements that think that modernism ought to, that getting rid of religion is a good thing, and we ought to do it. Okay, I'm not trying to take a side on that here. I would argue for the value of religion in a society, but we're not going there right now. What I want you to see is that what Berger is saying, I think in this article that you read, is correct. he corrects himself from when he was writing in the 60s and the 70s. And he says it doesn't actually make us less religious to become more modern. It just makes us more pluralized as a culture. We run into other people who don't believe like us. But religion is actually growing in the modern world. And this is something that people have not expected and are beginning to realize in the last 20 years or so. Because they're coming off of this idea, right? Rudolf Bultmann was a religion scholar, born in like the 1880s. I think 1886 he was born. And Bultmann, as a religion scholar, as a New Testament scholar, was pushing for the church to move away from belief in the actual truth of the miraculous and things like this. He said we cannot use electric lights and radios, and in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. But why not? Why can't we? And cultural development and history seem to argue against Bultmann. In fact, you see throughout the advancement of technology revivals in things like spiritualism, even in views of back in the 80s and early 90s, or even the early 2000s, there was a movement to neo-paganism, these kind of pagan principles of nature worship. People are just essentially religious, and it doesn't matter how technologically advanced we are. Most people look for some spiritual, religious, kind of eternal meaning in life. That's the reality. But getting back to Berger's argument, that reality exists in a pluralized context because you live next to people who have all these alternatives, all these options in front of them religiously and socially and culturally. So Bultmann proves to be wrong, and the world is getting more and more and more religious. And that's Berger's thesis, is that while we once understood that modernity would lead to the end of religion, Berger made his early career on that argument. He's now shifting. Back in the 1990s, he started this shift where he said, we now see that the outcome is not so much secularization as it is pluralization. So that's the thesis of this article that you should have read. And this is what we need to look at. So what does that imply for our societies? And he talks about society in the modern world, cultures, politics, governments have taken kind of one of three approaches. And this is important to think about and look at and how we do this. One, he says, is the American case. The idea that secularism accepts the institutional specialization of religion. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that the government, unlike European governments in the 1600s and 1700s, isn't going to endorse a religion. They're not going to pick, everybody to advance in government jobs, to get the good jobs. We're going to teach, we're going to teach in our schools Protestant Christianity or Catholic Christianity. But religion is for religious institutions to deal with. The government is not supposed to deal with that. But he says in this American model, it doesn't have to imply that it's anti-religious. Presidents still talk about prayer, or National Day of Prayer and fasting, but it's kind of the civil religion, right? We're going to talk generally about an idea of God. Most religions have an idea of God. Most Americans are kind of a Judeo-Christian background. Even today, about 70% of Americans claim some form of Christianity. So it's not like, the state doesn't ever allow for that. There are those who fight against any representation of it, but the Pledge of Allegiance has under God, the money has in God we trust. You'll hear presidents close a speech with God bless you. This is not anti-religious, but in doing those things, the state is not establishing any one church or religion. Berger calls this a moderate understanding of the separation of church and state. So Berger goes on that the state's not hostile to religion, but draws back from direct involvement in religious matters. So you have a separation, but not an animus, not an animosity, not a conflict necessarily. Right. So that's a big part of the issue. He goes on to talk about a third type of secularism that is not anything but benign. Right. It's hateful towards religion. He talks about the Soviet Union. Berger is obviously influenced by the Cold War. I mean, he's writing the 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. A lot of younger students may not, be that familiar with the Cold War, the issues of Russia, how Russia treated Christians with severe persecution, especially under Stalin, but Lenin as well. And after Stalin, churches destroyed, ministers imprisoned, monks killed, people sent to gulags for their faith. It was not good. China, these communist regimes were very harsh towards religious belief. You see Cambodia, you see the USSR, you see China. And these are earlier time periods, right? But still, some of this goes on. China now is establishing kind of a new crackdown on religious institutions. Lately, they've destroyed some large churches. They've imprisoned some pastors or put church leadership under house arrest. Not as severe as things were under Mao, not like things under Lenin and Stalin in the USSR, but certainly animosity towards religious institutions, and often harsh, oppressive, even violent treatment of religious believers in these communist regimes. A little bit closer to home, is Cuba. Sorry, I had a technical glitch there for a second. Just last year, I think Castro died. I think recently his brother was moved out of government or died. I can't remember. I just saw something about it. I haven't read about it. But Cuba, after the death of Castro, before the death of Castro, Castro was never good to religious institutions. He embraced this very Marxist idea that religion is a bad thing. There were some popes that tried to reach out and kind of break that, but it didn't really do much good. Churches have been destroyed by the government, religious leaders imprisoned. So there's real issues within these regimes. The one that Berger kind of focuses on and thinks about is the French one. This is a key point if you study sociology and philosophy and modernism and issues of pluralism and secularization. One of the big names, I think you saw a video of him early in the semester with Rabbi Sachs, was Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor talks about secularism a lot, right? And Taylor focuses a lot on this French understanding, which is based in the French Revolution. It's in many ways anti-Christian and anti-religious. It's not as oppressive now as, say, a communist regime. It has had moments in history. During the French Revolution, there was a time when there's a town that does not celebrate Bastille Day. They all wear black because in that town, I can't remember the name of it, but that town's history is steeped in this idea. They're a very devout Catholic community, and the whole town was nearly massacred during the French Revolution for their Catholic faith. So the French Revolution has a very anti-Christian element to it, and while the French government is not that anti-Christian, they can be oppressive. I knew someone who taught, worked as a principal at a Christian school for American religious workers in Belgium, in Europe, right? This is part of the center of the European Union, Western democratic country. And they gave that school so much trouble because they didn't like its Christian elements. They wanted students in their public education. But they, at some instances, sent home American teachers that had all their proper paperwork. They just decided to hassle them. So it happens in some of those Western European countries that are democratic. They're not persecuting religious people per se. They're not killing people and imprisoning ministers and destroying churches. There's still some elements of this Christianity in their history, but they're not necessarily friendly to religious institutions. And you see that especially in France. Berger calls this relatively benign. But my question is that true when we look at it? And I think that's an important question because I think the American institutions are moving more this way, which is problematic. We need to think about that as a culture. Because as we become more pluralized, the complexities of issues grow. Many things become more complex and more difficult. And I don't know that we as a culture want to move that direction where we become oppressive of religious people who we don't, it creates actions and reactions that we may not want the outcome of. And the reason I ask if that's true that it's relatively benign, I'm looking back a couple of years here, there's a story, but this type of thing happens in France, where they made a law against these things called burkinis on their beaches, where Muslim women are required to cover their body in very specific ways if they're of certain well, modesty is a big deal, right? They have various range of what modesty means, but there are some more moderate to conservative moderate Muslims who would go to the beach. They would wear these things that were kind of layers. It's not the burqa, it's not the full headscarf and all that. They would go out in this cooler clothes, but they could enjoy being on the beach. And France outlawed these. So what you have here in this picture is police, French police, actually forcing a Muslim woman to remove parts of her clothing in public. I'm not sure that's the direction we want to go, and I'm not sure that you can call that benign. I'm quite certain that that Muslim woman didn't feel like it was benign. So these are the types of things we have to think about. Berger makes some really good points. And I think by saying relatively benign, it's obviously in contrast to extreme secular violent persecution, destroying churches, arresting people, killing people that you see in these communist regimes. So that's the difference, and that's something to keep in mind here again, because I think the American system has these tendencies in it right now to move towards. You see in the right, political right, and the alt-right, you see this tendency of animosity towards certain segments of the Muslim population, rooted in fear and what's going on in the Middle East, and really a lack of understanding of Islam or certain realities that are present in Islam in parts of the Islamic world. Issues that we had, not to deny the issues with terrorism and the problems that we're facing, but there is this tendency on the right to group all Muslims in that context. Meanwhile, on the left, what do we have? Where you're bankrupting people, florists, cake bakers, you're putting them out of business because their understanding is that, their religious understanding is that, marriage is a religious institution between a man and a woman, and so they don't want to participate in a wedding. It's a gay wedding. And so we as a culture are choosing to put them out of business. It can be problematic for us. We need to think through those things, because when you start doing those things, you have to realize that the other political side may react. They may win, they may carry the day, and they may do things in the opposite direction. You begin to open these cans that you can't necessarily close when you start to move towards that less benign French system. Um, Now, Berger goes on, and this will kind of set up an introduction to what I want to discuss for just a little bit. And he talks about how all these are being resisted by a growth in what he talks about in the bottom of this passage as fundamentalism. A lot of people are worried about religious fundamentalism, and we kind of have these general and vague ideas of what that means. What is religious fundamentalism? We have different ideas. You can look up fundamentalism and see different definitions. One you can find is a form of religion that adheres to strict principles and beliefs of the religious scriptures. Involves the reassertion of traditional moral and religious values against changes that have taken place and those who support the changes. That's really a useless definition. It's a pointless definition. And if you look up fundamentalism, like in Wikipedia, there's online atlases and encyclopedias, you'll find often that they give these, very religious, the whole of life governed by Scripture. We have this idea in our culture, kind of the popular idea, the kind of the bias and the stereotypes of, you're closed-minded, you don't really think, the absolutist, and we belittle them, and then we have this whole reaction, from these new atheists, this kind of tending to see all religious people as somehow this kind of radical, harsh, mean, cruel, closed-minded group of fundamentalists. Like I said, this is from an online atlas. Religious fundamentalism refers to the belief of an individual or a group of individuals in the absolute authority of sacred religious text or teaching of a particular religious leader, prophet, and/or God. Well, let's see. That would encompass most religious people, right? I mean, Christian, absolute authority of Jesus. Yes, obviously. Muslims, absolute authority of God as revealed through the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran. They all believe that. So that's the kind of pointless point. Why is that different? So are you saying all religious people are fundamentalists? Okay, these fundamentalists believe that their religion is beyond any form of criticism and should therefore also be forced upon others. Okay, that may be a useful point, but what do you mean by forced? I think there are better definitions of fundamentalism that cover some people that aren't trying to force anybody. They may be trying to convince. Are we forcing people if we try really hard to convince you through argument and reason and intellectual debate? Is that a forcing? And I don't think we want to start calling that a forcing. That's part of our society. That's part of how our culture works. It's part of how civil society works, is that we debate, we discuss, we argue. So yeah, so is fundamentalism only people who take up weapons? Well, a lot of other people get called fundamentalists. So that piece of the definition doesn't really work well either. Then he goes on to say logical explanations and scientific evidence have no place in these belief systems if they work against the religious fundamentalism. Well, actually, there are a lot of things that could be called religious fundamentalism that spend a lot of time and energy trying to prove their points scientifically. If you know someone who is, or have read anyone who's a very devoted, within Christianity, there's this kind of debate over creation. Is it literally 7 days? Genesis 1 talks about, the first day God created, the second day God created. There are groups of Christians who take that day, very 24-hour days, and their response is not, well, screw science, it doesn't matter. Their response is, we're going to prove to you scientifically that the world was created in 7 24-hour days. How is that rejecting logic? They try very hard to give logical explanations. So that piece of this definition kind of goes out the window. For fundamentalists, religion dictates every sphere of their daily lives, and they also attempt to evolve entire society into their own belief system, often by the use of force. There's that use of force thing again. Okay, is it always by force, or is it often by force? Are they forcing? Is it forcing to try to convince, or is it forcing only if you use weapons? What do you mean? So this definition is not a good definition, but this is how a lot of people use fundamentalism. They throw it out there like this insult. It's a pejorative term. I don't like you. You're more religious than me, so you must be a fundamentalist. And that's a bad thing. We don't like fundamentalists, and you are one because you're more religious than me. And that's kind of what we do with this. This becomes pointless to the study of religion officially. It becomes pointless to academic discussion and research. Fundamentalism is a term that has a history and roots in an actual meaning that means something useful. And it may be that we can rescue the term for something useful. But this type of definition that's just insulting and pejorative, I mean, think about this. It dictates every sphere of their life. That's a fundamentalist? Oh, let's think. Mother Teresa was a fundamentalist. Pope Francis is a fundamentalist. I'm sure we could think of lots of other very devotedly religious people who've done amazing things for people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German who resisted Hitler because he was completely, religion dictated every sphere of his life. In fact, he wrote books upon books and was kicked off the radio as a preacher at the rise of Nazism because he was saying Christianity should engulf every aspect of your life and you cannot give devoted loyalty to this Nazi party. Is that a fundamentalist? This is the real problem with how we think, or perhaps fail to think, about what this means. Now, I get at this, it's not just in popular parlance either. There's kind of this sickness in scholarship about fundamentalism that gives just ridiculous and useless definitions, very pejorative ideas. There's one essay, there's a book, Fundamentalism and Gender, which is an interesting book, but it makes this mistake. It's like, anybody who's more religious than me, I'm going to criticize them, often in veiled terms, and it's not really fairly argued. But this is a scholar, Karen Brown. Fundamentalism is the religion of the stressed and disoriented, of those for whom the world is overwhelming. So she goes on to talk about emotionally imbalanced, intellectually inconsistent people who aggressively defend brittle truths. Okay, why is that not just an insult? What have you said of any substance with that statement? John Hawley is another writer. He describes fundamentalism using phrases in quotation marks, kind of like when you give the air quotes. Quotation marks, it's just supposed to offset these as, I'm not saying this about people, but they're backwards looking, they're old fashioned, they're outdated, they don't understand, they're intellectually stressed. And you would put these types of phrases in quotes as descriptive, as if to distance himself from them. But he goes on to support those views and criticize people without much real support. Within that book, Sayed Hussein Nasser is not in that book. He's a Muslim scholar who talks about how many modern scholars of religion criticize devout believers using terms like fundamentalist pejoratively. And Nasser kind of takes a shot back in the other direction. He said, one of the features which characterize modern man is that he always seeks to reform everything, but rarely is he willing to reform himself. And Nasser makes this point that a lot of these scholars that dislike what they call fundamentalism, of people who are very devout, very committed to their religion, for whom their religion impacts the whole of their life, are simply people who run their life wholly on something else and don't want to be criticized. They accuse people of not accepting criticism when they themselves don't want to accept criticism. And in fact, in that book on fundamentalism and gender, there's another scholar who critiques kind of the book of the essays. Jay Harris, he offers this counter-argument. He said, what we intend to suggest through this effort to diagnose their fundamentalists' underlying mentality is that these people do not deal with anxieties of stress and disempowerment as well as we moderns do. They need to flee to irrationality while we boldly advance to meet the challenges of the day rationally. He goes on to say that such approaches Ignore the ugly imperialistic side of modern culture. What's the ugly imperialistic side of modern culture? Well, let's see. Forcing a woman to undress on the beach when she takes modesty very important. Or, Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot, Castro's regime, the destruction of churches in China, forcing average middle-class people out of a business that they've grown and built on their own because they don't agree with the cultural norm of our society based on their religion. That's kind of ugly and imperialistic, if you think about it fairly. So this term fundamentalism gets used as a weapon against people who are more religious than perhaps some of the rest of us. People who we don't agree with, people who take certain aspects of religion too seriously, and it becomes a meaningless word. It becomes a weapon, not an academic term. And as Harris says, many of these definitions fail to say anything useful and fail to say anything really at all, other than, I don't like you. For Harris, and I think he's right, oftentimes in the media, in popular use, even in scholarship, the word fundamentalism gets used as another way of saying, I think you're stupid, or I think you're backwards, or I think you're dangerous. And we have words for that, and it's not fair to use that so blatantly. If I call ISIS fundamentalist, there may be reason for that. And if I call Westboro Baptist fundamentalist, there may be reason for that. And if I call somebody who's aggressively, trying to convince everyone that we ought to teach the world was created in 7 24-hour days, maybe that's fundamentalist. But if we just throw that term around for all those people, what are we saying? Are they doing the same thing? I don't think they're looking for the same outcomes. There's a group called Answers in Genesis. So how should we talk about fundamentalism? What is it? What is the point of it? Fundamentalism has a history. It wasn't a bad history necessarily. It was actually used to. Fundamentalists had meaning as much as Reformation, right? If you talk about Reformation theology, then we know that you're probably talking about the theology of Calvin or Luther or the Anglican Church or Zwingli or these Reformed movements starting in the late 1400s up through the mid 1500s, early 1600s. This movement, it had specific historical realities happening. That's the Reformation. And when we talk about the Reformation, it means something in religious circles. And so if we talk about a religion reforming, we're kind of hinting back at that idea that there are major shifts in the way the religion is believed and embraced on a large scale. And there's counter-Reformation movements and traditional movements. So that's a useful term because it refers to something. And if we say the Reformation in a Western context, we know what I mean. Used to fundamentalism was the same thing. It was this history of, in the late 19th, early 20th century, Bible scholars and even some preachers were starting to say, well, maybe we shouldn't take the Bible so seriously. Maybe there are textual problems with it. Maybe there are historical problems with it. And this was the movement of scholarship. Like I said, late 1800s, early 1900s. That's where you saw Bultmann that I mentioned early on in the lecture. And so a large group of Christian ministers and scholars said, no, we're not going to do that. We hold the fundamental teachings of the Bible as we received it from the Reformers, which is largely within Protestant movements. And they were called fundamentalists, and they took that name on. It was fine with them, because what they were saying is, we take the Bible not as a book that we can pick apart, but as a book that, not as a book that we criticize, but as a book that criticizes us. And we want to study it, we want to understand it, but we think it's historically valid, that it's theologically accurate and historically accurate. And we may interpret it slightly differently, but we're not just going to say we don't believe, Bultmann didn't believe in miracles anymore. Other scholars were doing that kind of thing. We're not going to read the Bible as if, oh, we should get rid of the miracles and certain things don't line up with what we think now, so Jesus must not have said those. Fundamentalists were reacting to this sort of desacralization of the Bible. And so it had a very specific meaning, a very specific historical context that mattered. But we've moved away from that, right? That movement, and what we have now, coming out of that 19th century, 20th century context, is the word began to get thrown around as a criticism. If you think of this, if you've heard of the Scopes monkey trial, William Jennings Bryan is a very aggressive promoter of this battle about the teaching of evolution, and that got picked up in the popular movie Inherit the Wind, which really wasn't fair to the fundamentalist side of that. Not that, you don't have to. Not saying which side is right on the scientific debate, but the way they kind of lampooned the speakers. William Jennings Bryan was a very well-spoken and well-respected political figure in the late 19th, early 20th century. He's not some cartoon that the caricatures of the movie made him out to be. He's very committed to logical argument. So that popularizing, that kind of caricaturing of that side in movies like that, and fundamentalist begins to become this negative term for people who we think are too religious or silly about their religion or unintellectual about their religion. And there were certainly anti-intellectual movements within evangelicalism of that period. There's no doubt about that. I've written whole papers on that. I'm not denying that. But it was a movement, and it gets turned into this kind of insult, this criticism of religious people. And then we start to have, conflicts in the Middle East more and more. They're more, not just that they're more conflicts, but we begin to see them more as a population because of news media, because of what's going on. In the 80s, you get issues in Beirut, in Lebanon. You get the hostage situation in Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so this word that we've used to insult people that we think are too radically religious Christians starts getting used for radical Muslims. And we don't make a distinction or differentiation, and it becomes this kind of insult that we just talked about. But if we want to use it, if we want to say there is a family resemblance, how can we use the word fundamentalism helpfully, academically speaking? Can we make it useful at all? And I think some of the things that matter, we need to understand that fundamentalism is not just centered around a text. Most religions are centered around a text. And most devout people take that text very seriously. But fundamentalism is centered around a very specific interpretation of the text. Some scholars talk about it being monosemic. There's one meaning, and one meaning only. And it's very obvious when you read it. You should see that meaning. You'll read an article that kind of takes that approach, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This can be the case for someone who's a violent Muslim fundamentalist, an angry kind of Westboro Baptist fundamentalist, or a fairly, benign kind of fundamentalist evangelical, arguing very seriously and almost aggressively, but not meanly, not violently, for a literal 7-day creation interpretation of Genesis 1. That's the thing they have in common, not the outcome of their idea, but how they come to their idea. And they come to their idea through a very specific monosemic interpretation of the text. You have to read it this way. It's very obvious. It should be obvious to everyone. That's the understanding of the fundamentalist. That's what we'll say is the family resemblance. That's what I'm talking about. It's not a shared history. It's not a shared outcome of the beliefs. But what is it that we can talk about? A Hindu fundamentalist, or an ISIS Muslim fundamentalist, or a Wahhabi Muslim in a Salafi in Saudi Arabia that's very, 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 very strict, incredibly strict. Women can't drive. They have to be fully hijab. They have to wear these dark sunglasses. That's not necessarily the same thing as ISIS, which is not the same thing as Westboro Baptist, which is not the same thing as Ken Ham, who you'll read, who is a kind of Christian, seven-day creationist, fundamentalist in many ways. And I don't think he would turn down that label, and I don't mean it pejoratively. What's the family resemblance? They're not, Ken Ham, Westboro Baptist, they're not out with guns trying to kill people. Even the Salafi Muslim in Saudi Arabia is not out waging war on people like ISIS is. So you have different outcomes of these different fundamentalist movements. But what's the resemblance? The resemblance is in the method they use to interpret the scripture. And it always comes down to there's one specific interpretation, and it's theirs. Oftentimes they are focused on power, especially political power. Right, we want to make political changes that make things more friendly to our ideas, or maybe even push our ideas. They often downplay the miraculous. This seems odd to a lot of people that we talk about fundamentalists downplaying the miraculous, because a lot of kind of aggressively anti-religious, kind of, I would call fundamentalist proponents of scientism, if you remember that discussion, act as though you're a bunch of superstitious nitwits who want to do magic and throw out science. That's not usually the case. Fundamentalists usually try to prove their case with science. They try to argue their case with science. Maybe they don't use it well, but that's what they often do. Radical fundamentalist groups that use violence, they're not like riding around on horses with swords. They are fully embracing modern technology. And they will fully embrace modern political methods, which aren't always in line with certain readings and understandings of their own scripture. Think about the video with King Abdullah of Jordan, right? He's criticizing ISIS, saying, you're not being faithful to the religion in your interpretation of politics and power. And in fact, there are a lot of Muslims who believe that God will eventually set up Sharia over the whole world, but that God will do that either through people converting or this miraculous figure, the Mahdi, or maybe even Jesus, who was seen as a prophet, returning and setting up God's rule in the world very miraculously. Okay, so they're not out to like raise up their own army and go do it themselves, which is what ISIS is doing. They're not looking for a miraculous intervention. They're trying to be an actual, immediate, physical, non-miraculous, political, power-grabbing solution to what they see as the problem. Fundamentalism usually downplays tradition. You must have our very basic, clear, obvious, straightforward, kind of common sense reading of this scriptural text that's right in front of you. All this traditional stuff, we're going to throw it out. In the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years of Christian or Muslim or Hindu thought on these matters, these reformers, they've gotten us off track. They've loaded down, the message with stuff that doesn't matter and isn't real. Oftentimes that tradition has correctives for the things that they may be doing that's problematic within the tradition itself, without looking outside of something that's against their faith or contrary to their faith. There's often a critique of what they're doing within the tradition, but they don't accept the tradition. They don't like the tradition. They think they're getting back to this very purist form of what was originally taught. And it's very obvious. You should see this original teaching just by a basic reading. Forget that 1,000 or 2,000 years of history may have changed our understanding of terminology and ideas, and we may not fully grasp the meaning of stories that were told, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We may need to do some cultural study and some historical study. That's That's secondary. You should be able to just understand it by reading it for yourself right now in the 21st century. So that's a common family resemblance, which I would argue means that this is a very modern movement. And you'll watch a short video by another very prominent, I'm an adjunct professor, but a very prominent scholar, Karen Armstrong, who says that fundamentalism is a modern movement. This is a modern reality. This is not traditional. This isn't about devotion necessarily. It's not that they aren't devout, but it's a modern interpretation. It's a modern understanding of how we read and how we understand.